Welcome, everyone, to today's installment of the Computer Science Alumni and Friends Virtual Public Lecture Series. Tonight, our guest is Tim Belsher. A warm virtual welcome to members and friends of the University of Regina and its three federated colleges, the First Nations University of Canada, Campion College, and Luther College. The University of Regina is situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence on Treaty 6 lands. These are the territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. So a bit about the Computer Science Department. Final approval to create the Department of Computer Science was granted in November 1968. Some of the first graduates of the program convocated in 1974 as the University of Saskatchewan Regina campus became the University of Regina. Larry Symes, who is an alumnus of the University of the Regina campus of the U of S, was the first department head. So this is our seventh event in our series. Watch for details about our next event in spring. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. You can send them to me, Daryl Hepting, daryl.hepting@uregina.ca. So I should say that I'm also an alumnus, and a friend of the department, and I'm a professor in the department as well. So a bit about our guest, Tim Belsher. He's coming to us from Vancouver. Tim has been in the computer graphics industry for over 25 years, working in film in both technical and artistic leadership roles, and more recently doing the same thing in the games industry. Tim was born in Regina and moved with his family to British Columbia in 1985. He has a computer science degree from Simon Fraser University, and that's where I met him. So without further ado, please help me welcome Tim for his presentation, My Career in Film and Games, Merging Tech and Art.
Okay, here I can share my screen. Yeah, thanks, Daryl. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Yeah, as Daryl mentioned, I'm Tim Belsher. And yeah, I want to talk about just, yeah, my career in both the film and the games industry. And, just kind of over the years, what I've learned about kind of just the way, tech and art merges, in particular in computer graphics in general, but then specifically in both the film and the games industries. So a brief, overview of the agenda. I'm going to give, an introduction, go over kind of just my career, and how that applies to merging both tech and art. Then I'm going to kind of describe the kind of the similarities and the differences between film and games, and then get into just kind of what I consider future challenges, and then we can kind of finish it off with questions. I do want to say that, I currently am working for Electronic Arts, but I do want to preface this that, my opinions are my opinions. I'm not really speaking on necessarily behalf of Electronic Arts. So yeah, just wanted to start the discussion with that. So as Daryl mentioned, I was born in Regina. So I have a tie to University of Regina. I never went there, but I do know Regina well. My mom actually has her teaching degree from U of R. They both both my parents grew up in Saskatchewan, then went to high school at Luther in Regina, and then yeah, as Daryl mentioned, I moved to BC in 1985. I'm still a big Rider fan because it's kind of in your blood. I've unfortunately my dad and I, who's here, we often go to the Rider games, or we always go to the Rider games whenever they're in town playing the Lions. And I've indoctrinated my poor children into Rider Nation. So, anyways, and yeah, as Daryl mentioned, I was in the graphics. I've been in the graphics industry for over 25 years. film industry for the first 20 years of my career, and then the games industry since 2017. So about 7 years I've yeah, and I'm a technical art director at Electronic Arts Vancouver, and that's where I've been since 2017. So it's been almost 7 years now that I've been at EA. So what exactly do I need by merging tech and art? So I always kind of describe computer graphics where geek meets art. And I come at that from a software engineering background that then ended up moving into an art role. And I've kind of popped back and forth between tech and art throughout my career. Um, my career objective kind of, for the past many years has been to combine both my technical and artistic skills in a creative environment. I'd say I probably started the industry thinking I was much more technical than I was. Or sorry, I started the industry thinking I was much more technical and not really thinking of myself as artistic. And then as I kind of grew in the industry, I realized that no, this industry is a mix of tech and art, and I think I do have some artistic skill and have a bit of an artistic eye and stuff. So I've kind of enjoyed throughout my career, kind of popping back and forth between both and mixing them, frankly. And definitely computer graphics and film and games definitely give you that opportunity to mix the two. So going way back, this is my early high school influences. I always bring this up. So, you know, I grew up knowing Star Wars, liked Star Wars as a little kid, but then in your teens, you just kind of forget about it. And then when I was a teenager, or when I was, I think it was about 12, 14 or something like that, I ended up buying this Star Wars role-playing game. And it just, I wasn't big into the game itself, but it reminded me just how cool the Star Wars universe is. And then a buddy of mine had this Industrial Light and Magic book, this Art of Special Effects. And I remember seeing this book and I thought it was huge. And, being in high school, you don't spend $75 on a book, but I loved this book, saved up my money, and then bought this thing. So, and I still have it to this day. And so that was kind of my journey of discovering Star Wars, discovering ILM, and just realizing that, hey, maybe, if I could get into this film industry, it would be pretty cool. So, and that was, like I said, about probably grade 10 that I kind of discovered that. So I was pretty lucky that, I think a lot of people, a lot of younger kids, I know my kids are, figuring out like, what do they want to do next? And there's so many opportunities nowadays. And so knowing kind of what I wanted to do in grade 10 was pretty nice. But I still had to kind of figure out how I fit in computer graphics. Or sorry, I shouldn't say computer graphics. I was thinking visual effects. So, basically at the time when I started at Simon Fraser University, as Daryl mentioned, I started in engineering because at the time there wasn't really computer graphics. Or no, sorry, I should say there wasn't computer graphics in film. Um, there was a little bit here and there, but in general, it was very kind of special one-offy type stuff, and it didn't really seem like it was ready. And then, frankly, in my first and second year, Terminator 2 came out, and then Jurassic Park, and it was like, whoa, okay, this graphics thing, this may work. So I started in engineering thinking I might get into you know like they had remote cameras, and I thought, well, maybe like some type of robotics or something like that, and was trying to figure out how I'd fit. And then these two movies came along, and it was pretty obvious that okay, this computer graphics thing is going to be become very critical in visual effects. So I ended up switching over to computing science. My focus was in graphics. I wouldn't say I have like a major in graphics, so I don't think at that time you could get majors in graphics. There was a handful of graphics courses, but really, most of the real kind of bleeding edge stuff was being done at the SFU graduate graphics lab. So I was an undergrad at the time. And most of the people in the graphics lab were PhD and master's students. And so it was a really cool opportunity that I got to be able to work with that. And as Daryl mentioned, this is where I met Daryl, who was working in the graduate graphics lab. So so that was a good opportunity. So then I started my career. I ended up starting at Mainframe Entertainment. For those who don't know it, Reboot, we made Reboot, which was I'm pretty sure it was the first kind of full CG TV show. And then from there, there was, so I didn't join right at the beginning. So Reboot season 1 and 2 had already come out, but around that time, Beast Wars was coming out, which was a Transformers TV show. And then eventually there was Reboot season 3 came out. There was a bunch of like, they started doing digital, or sorry, direct to video kind of movies. So, Barbie, they're still doing it now actually at Mainframe. And then I also had an opportunity to work just in the early days of setting up kind of the look of Spider-Man. So I was a software engineer, you know, basically building various kind of pipeline tools, as well as like facial animation software called Grin. At that time, nowadays the film industry, most of your pipeline tools are all Python. Generally, kind of every application has Python, a Python API, and so you end up doing a lot of work now, now in Python. But at that time, there wasn't as much Python. It was kind of C or C++. Facial animation, this was like a kind of a separate standalone software. Nowadays, you'd probably do your facial animation directly in the DCC. So you'd have a Maya rig and you could set it up and kind of move around things and everything like that. But at the time, we were using Softimage 3D. It wasn't very configurable. And so it was just easier to write a separate standalone package and then export that into Softimage to kind of get it back in. And then, as I mentioned, I did some early kind of non-photorealistic rendering shader work on Spider-Man. It was pretty cool because nowadays there's a ton of CG that does the whole non-photorealistic rendering, but back then there wasn't a lot of that, and so to kind of play that, play with that look and feel and get the, kind of the cartoon shading as well as kind of the contour shading to make it look a little bit more 2D yeah, it was really a fun project to work on. And I left Mainframe before Spider-Man kind of started, but I was, like I said, in there in the early kind of prototyping and figuring out the look of things stage. Um, so this is kind of going to date myself. I'd like to kind of give this as kind of a historical, uh, um, uh, just explain kind of where the industry was at the early on in my career. So just before I left Mainframe, we were looking at the time we were using silicon graphics. So they're called SGI machines. And they were super expensive, but that was really the only way you could really run graphics. Softimage was on there, the precursor to Maya, Alias Wavefront was on there. You really didn't have an opportunity to use these things on a PC. But around the early 2000s, all of a sudden these PCs were like, we had people that had a more powerful PC at home rather than these really expensive boxes at work. So that's when we started looking at the figuring out the migration paths, getting onto these more powerful, cheaper machines, the PCs. So we ended up deciding to port to Linux. We were kind of debating Linux versus Windows. SGIs were all Unix based, so we ended up deciding that Linux was the way. And if you look at the film industry now, most VFX companies are using Linux. So, but just to kind of give you this background, or the reason I give you this background is VFX at that time, or just CG and computer graphics in general, was a massive capital investment. So, to get into the industry, it was pretty it was very expensive. And just to give you kind of what the mid 1990s prices were, this SGI workstation here is about 20 to 50K. The Indigo or the Octane, I think it was, and it had a whopping 256 mega RAM. This SGI Onyx, this is what we had to do our facial animation software to get like kind of guaranteed 24 frames per second feedback. That was a 4 CPU machine with a whopping 512 mega RAM, and that was like in the 100,000 plus range. Softimage 3D, this is the precursor to XSI for those who know that. It was kind of one license was anywhere between 8 to 14K. So yeah, so it was a different time. There wasn't as many kind of small shops that were just opening up and doing visual effects or anything like that. It was it really was yeah, a pretty massive capital investment to get into it. And so yeah, so this kind of when PCs took over and SGI sadly kind of went away, they it was it definitely changed the industry and opened it up. So after 6 years at Mainframe, I ended up going to, I had an opportunity to work at Industrial Light and Magic. So this was down in San Francisco. Went down there. I started off as a pipeline TD. So I did like artist, similar kind of artist tools. At that time, ILM looked at XSI for a few titles that they were, or sorry, I'm in game modes. A few film projects that they were on, they were using XSI. And I did some shader work and basically just, as a pipeline TD, you're dealing with like kind of pushing things through the pipeline. So there was asset management and tracking and tools and XSI we use for animation and rigging. So there was some rigging and animation tools that I did. And then I ended up kind of halfway through. I was at ILM for 4 years, and I did 2 years of being a pipeline TD, and then 2 years as more of an artist. Um, artists they Artists down in film are called technical directors. Just so you know, technical director is quite different in games. So when I say I was a technical director, they all look at me rather kind of funny. Technical director is basically your lead engineer in games. So, but in film, technical directors are artists. I think they just called it that because, at the time you had to be very technical and artistic. Yeah, they're still called TDs to this day. But I moved over into an artist role. So I did more lighting, look dev. I did some sims, some simulations. So I did some water sims for Poseidon. Yeah, so I worked on Star Wars Episode 3, War of the Worlds, and Poseidon. And then we ended up deciding to move back to Vancouver. We had a daughter while we were down there, and when she turned 2, just realized like, hey, we want to be back in Vancouver. Both the grandparents were, all the grandparents were here, and decided to move back. Um, and oh, this is just kind of an interesting side note. Try not to be super name droppy, but this was just a neat experience being at ILM and just being kind of amongst the history and being with so many kind of legends. So I got a tour of the ILM model shop at the time. you know, ILM was primarily, it was doing a lot more computer graphics, but they still had the old traditional kind of model shop, so building models and filming them, and they still had kind of a smallish kind of model shop that would do, for key kind of important situations where it worked better to have models. So anyway, so I got this great tour from this model shop. It was by this Charlie Bailey, and it was funny at the end of the tour he showed me, I walk into this room and he's like, this is what I'm working on now, and it was basically the Darth Vader Star Destroyer from like, a New Hope, or actually it might have been Empire Strikes Back, and it was basically the first thing he ever worked on. He had been at ILM for a long time, almost since the start. And he was working on this thing was traveling around the Smithsonian, and it had fallen over and broken, so it got shipped back to him and he was fixing it. And while he was at it, he opened it up and he was fixing and putting better lights in it and all that stuff. Anyways, I came home, opened up that book that I showed you, my ILM Art of Special Effects, looked up Charlie Bailey, and here he was. And so he was looking older. He was grayer when I met him, but this was basically him working on this executor. So before I left, I brought in my book, and this is actually a picture of him, signed by Charlie Bailey, who had been there, I guess, yeah, since 1979. So, but it was just, yeah, the reason I bring that up, it's just, it was a really neat experience working at kind of, where you had dreamt of, and people that you had read about, and yeah, it was just, yeah, a pretty amazing tour he gave me. So anyway, so I moved back to Vancouver. I ended up kind of over from 2006 to 2017. I ended up kind of popping around to different companies, kind of working there for a few years, to 5 years kind of thing. And I worked at Vanguard, Image Engine, Digital Domain Vancouver, and then Industrial Light and Magic opened up a shop in Vancouver. And so yeah, so some of the highlights just kind of from that part of my career. Um, it was, I had a mix of technical and artistic roles. I was a CG supervisor as well as a pipeline supervisor. So a pipeline supervisor was similar to what I was doing before, dealing with pipelines and kind of managing pipeline TDs. CG supervisor was more artistic. that would be working with the artist, giving artistic feedback, doing, as a CG supervisor, my focus was more on the lighting and look dev side of things. But I'd work with like, VFX artists that are blowing stuff up and giving feedback and stuff like that, and working closely with the VFX supervisor. So yeah, so I kind of, like I said, I've always kind of popped between the tech and art side of things. So what was neat also about this is, being part of ILM Vancouver, Digital Domain Vancouver, we were small shops that were opening up. We were like kind of sister companies to kind of the LA studio or the San Francisco studio. So, being part of that when, it was very small, and watching it grow to, 300 people or, or whatever it was. So building teams, building cultures, watching kind of, the companies change as they go from 50 to 100 to 200. And so just, kind of trying to be involved and helping to kind of shape that as much as I could in my position was a lot of, was a challenge and a lot of fun. District 9, for those who haven't seen it, it was this little, it was a little cult classic that we thought we were working on, and then it came out and it exploded, and so it was, it was a neat project to work on. We thought it would find, like I said, like kind of a little cult following, and then it ended up exploding and it got nominated for a couple Academy Awards. It was pretty insane. And then around that time, kind of Vancouver, the VFX industry, also exploded, and that's when Digital Domain kind of opened up their studio in Vancouver, and then eventually ILM and Sony ImageWorks. So it was, it was a great show to work on, District 9, and then it was just kind of great being, an interesting time being in Vancouver as things kind of, just like I said, exploded. And then yeah, and then ILM Vancouver, that was an interesting one because it was kind of this full circle working with old friends. I left ILM, really, I loved the company. I loved working there. It was just I wanted to live in Vancouver, so this was the perfect opportunity where I can work at ILM, work with some old friends. ILM's notorious for like, retention. They keep people there for 10, 15 years. And so to come kind of full circle and be working, in my quote unquote hometown per se, and but working with old friends and working on some very cool projects. So this is another one where it just was kind of a neat opportunity to, work, I had some really cool opportunities to meet some pretty amazing people. And so John Knoll, he's the VFX soup. He was the VFX soup on Pacific Rim when I worked at ILM Vancouver. He's the ILM's chief creative officer, but he's also the co-inventor of Photoshop. And I remember he came for a visit in Vancouver, and I was just asking him about the early days of ILM because he had been there, not at the very beginning, but in quite in the early days. And the interesting story about him was him and his brother also co-invented Photoshop. And so he was basically working at ILM, and I think if I remember correctly, he was working nights. And then during the day, he would take this software that him and his brother were developing and try to kind of pitch it and sell it. So what was amazing was I went for lunch with him. He was telling me just kind of the backstory of ILM and then the Photoshop, and went back and he opened up his laptop and he had an old emulator of Photoshop 1.0. So this is kind of a picture of what, the original Photoshop looked like. And for those who do not know it, this is a good old floppy disk, and that's how they used to distribute it. So, anyways, but it was just a very cool experience to be able to get to know John, and someone who's has such a massive influence. He invented a verb. You can Photoshop things. So, anyways, another perk of the job, being in film, is being able to go to these. Go to the premieres. So this is my wife and I at the Force Awakens premiere, and she got to meet Mark Hamill. She was very excited. Doctor Strange, there's Stan Lee, there's Robert Downey Jr., Benedict Cumberbatch, and then Captain America, Samuel Jackson, and Chris Evans, and Tomorrowland here was cool. This was a blue carpet in the spirit of Tomorrowland. So definitely one of the perks of the jobs, of being in film. So so the one thing that I was struggling with is the work-life balance in film. It's the projects, they were fun and you could do amazing things, but there was so much work to do, and it was often like, they wanted it in less and less time. And so there was a lot of crunch, and there was a lot of, late nights at the beginning of or sorry, at the end of a project. They'd add shots, and so it was always, you were super proud of the work, but it was starting to cut into, and so my work-life balance was not great. And I had friends that worked at EA. I started, looking around, like, well, maybe the games industry, let's see what it's like. And I had friends at EA, and they had a great life work balance. And I was lucky enough to get a job there. So, I gotta admit, I wasn't a big gamer. So this one, probably most of you don't know what this is, but this is what I grew up playing, was ColecoVision. And if you look at these fine graphics, that's what the football game looked like. And then, in high school, I ended up getting a Nintendo, an NES system, and played a lot of Zelda. And, the graphics were definitely better on that, but they were nowhere what they were like, when I joined at EA. So this is just a handful of EA games. And yeah, so I ended up moving to EA in 2017. I started off as a tech art, or started as, or I am a tech art director, but I started working on Plants vs. Zombies, Battle for Neighborville, and then I ended up finishing up the tail end of UFC 4, and then started on the beginning of UFC 5. UFC 5 was an interesting project, because that was UFC 5 ended up porting from into our new game engine Frostbite. So that was really neat, being kind of part of the original kind of porting from our old game engine into our new game engine Frostbite. So it definitely, learned a lot there. And then most recently, I've moved into a role under it's called Sports Tech, and Sports Tech Art is my group. And what it does, I can't unfortunately get into the specifics of what we're working on, but it works on shared initiatives across EA Sports titles. Often we're games very much build their own initiatives, and there's some opportunities of building some of these shared initiatives that can work across the EA Sports titles. So one day I'll be able to tell you what I'm doing. Right now, not so much. But yeah, so, and just for those who don't know, technical art. I didn't really know personally what a technical artist was myself. But it's basically it's the bridge between artists, engineers, and game designers. So, you know, technical artists, we're kind of a mix of some that are very technical, and some that are more artistic. Um, and 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 then kind of anywhere in between. But really, you know, we've, some of them, yeah, some that are more technical might build more tools, and then the art ones might kind of do more of the design and stuff like that. But it's a full gamut of technical and artists, but we all have kind of a technical bent. We like to, work with the artists, help debug things, help build tools, help work with their workflows and stuff like that. So yeah, we build tools, we build content workflows for the artists. We also help ingest content into the game in an efficient and performant manner. Content creators, artists will like build content, but to get it into the game, make sure that it's set up, it's got the proper parameters on there, so that so that it runs at a given at a proper frame rate and stuff like that. Working with game designers and software engineers to help develop game features. There's yeah, just with data-driven game engines, there's a lot of kind of setup that, a lot of parameters that can be tweaked and developed and designed. So we work closely with the game designers and SEs to help kind of, build the content that is needed for these for new game features. So yeah, so that's kind of my career. That's where I'm at now. What I want to kind of cover now is, what I see as kind of the major differences between film and games. So for those of you that are interested in film or games, like, what are the differences? What are the similarities and what are the differences? I've got a handful of kind of pictures on the side that I just grabbed from my demo reel of various kind of shots stuff that I've worked on over the years. So this is some crowd shots from Force Awakens. So yeah, so the film industry, I would say it's all about the image. It's you know, basically you're really just pushing bleeding edge visuals. It's you need to make this thing look as interesting as possible and as accurate as possible. And it's really about that. And so, throughout my career, there's been major innovations. It's, cloth, subsurface scattering, ray tracing, fluid dynamics, rigid body dynamics. Now muscle simulations are becoming more and more common. So, there was just a ton of things that have come that have grown throughout my career. I put this a lot is, and I put solved kind of in quotes. So a lot is solved in film with offline rendering and simulations and commercial tools. So the reason I put solved in quotes is you can always make things more efficient and faster and better. But in general, like a big one was like, how do you do fluid in things? Or early on, it was like, how do you do cloth? And people, the number of the big studios had their own proprietary cloth engines. And now cloth, you would never write your own cloth system. You would just use Maya's built in cloth, or Houdini has one or whatever. So a lot of these things are now kind of like I said, solved and available in commercial tools in the film industry. So you can produce amazing images, but there's not quite as much R&D that used to that used to happen, and that used to be more proprietary. So the games industry, it's also about the visuals, but it's not just an image. It's visuals and experience. Um, so similar solutions to film, there's obviously real-time cloth, and there's real-time subsurface scattering, and there's real-time this and that. So it's very similar solutions to film. The content is built in a similar way. So when I came in and understanding how the assets are built, and it is built in a very similar way. But the key is there's obviously additional real-time performance challenges. The texture size that we may use in film, when you're getting up right to the nose or something like that, it can be insane, the size of the size of the texture, but you're not going to have those in a real-time perform. That's just not going to perform in a real-time performant way. Um, Gameplay. This was something, not being a hardcore gamer, when I joined, I really appreciate games now. I play more games. I'm not great at them because I started a little too late with the first person shooters and stuff. But I really appreciate just the thought and the process, the design and the tuning that goes into it. So there's this whole thing called gameplay and game design. And yeah, and just what it takes to make a feature, what it takes to like create a character that has certain abilities, making sure that they're not overpowered, not OP. And so there's a lot that goes into the design of it to make just really interesting levels or features or this or that, or characters, like I said before. But then also then tuning that, making sure that it's, like I said, not overpowered and it doesn't play. So there's a lot of just finesse that happens in the gameplay, and that's definitely something that we don't have in film. Art decisions based on gameplay. This one was interesting, chatting with an art director. Like the silhouette of a character needs to be very distinct. It's if you're off, fighting someone or whatever, and you want to look off in the distance, you want to kind of recognize, is that your player? Is that player on your side, or is that on someone else's? So, like for example, on Plants vs. Zombies, the silhouette of the character was definitely taken into considerations and would drive the art based on gameplay. Character customizations. This was something I just, not being a hardcore gamer when I joined Plants vs. Zombies, it was all about character customizations and getting a new skin and getting this and getting that. And yeah, just understanding what goes into that process and um yeah, just building all that and hooking it up and making sure that it works in game, making sure that all these customizations are performant, and you know, you don't want to have some elaborate thing that just totally takes down your frame rate and makes the game really slow or anything. So you know, dealing with character customizations was definitely kind of an eye opener for me. Lighting challenges, you know, lighting in film, you've got a locked off camera and you want to put a rim light, it's right there. Well, you can't put these harsh rim lights in film or in games because they can spin the camera around. There's, you know, a rim light is very dependent on where the camera is, and you don't have a locked off camera. So just knowing the challenges from a lighting perspective about that kind of, you know, dealing with, you know, with the games. And then lastly was the yearly titles. So, or I should say cyclical titles. In our case, you know, our sports titles are often yearly, although UFC is not. But anyways, but the yearly cyclical titles, the challenge of maintaining asset quality, you know, and really avoiding content debt. What I mean by that is, you know, you build an asset, you know, this year, and then 5 years later, you're building another asset, and these things, you know, sometimes we remove, you know, older content, but sometimes you keep that. And so you want to make sure that you maintain the quality of that content. You can't have, so for example, you can't have an artist go through and tweak all the content year after year after year. So how do you kind of up the quality of that? So as a technical artist, we might like look at writing scripts that might automate this, or, you know, up this or do this or that, or, you know, sometimes it does require just an artist to go in there, but, you know, given just the growing amount of content that you can acquire over these cyclical titles, then you really want to kind of avoid that content. Um, this thing was interesting, and you know, it sounds kind of obvious, but you know, you know, after the fact, I was like, oh, it's definitely different. So the ratio of artists to engineers. So there's definitely way more artists versus software engineers in film. I put software engineers and SEs. If you hear me say SE, that's a software engineer. That's what we generally call them at EA. And anyway, so more artists versus software engineers in film. So there's just significantly more artists producing images in film. Whereas, you know, in games, we're very much delivering a software product. So, you know, there's a lot of content that goes into the game, but there is a lot of software engineering that is involved. So, you know, so delivering a software product that involves like software engineers, that involves like your quality control. So your QV team, you've got producers, you've got artists, you've got TAs. You know, and then from within there, your different types of SEs. You've got rendering SEs, you've got gameplay SEs, you've got systems SEs, you've got generalist SEs. So for, you know, for the software engineers out there that are interested in games, there's really a lot of opportunities to, you know, focus on, you know, if you really like rendering, perfect, go into rendering. But if you want to be more of a generalist, then you can be a generalist. You want gameplay. So and then also what was interesting, you know, at EA, we have our own game engine, Frostbite. So you have game engine software engineers, but you also have game team software engineers. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff that you get quote unquote for free with the game engine, but then there is a lot of like, you know, software engineering that needs to be specific to the game. And that's where your game team SEs are involved. So, you know, so even yeah, an opportunity as a software engineer, you could be more in the engine or you could be more at the game team level, you know, just depending on your interests. And I know people that, you know, engineers that have kind of done both. Also project management, this sounds, you know, may not be the most exciting, but there's definitely a difference in project management. For those who don't know, waterfall versus agile, waterfall is more of like, well, you do A, then B, then C, then D, and, you know, things are kind of dependent on each other. Whereas agile is really more of an engineering kind of approach to things where, you know, it's a little bit more free form. You know, you don't necessarily know exactly what you're going to do. Bugs might come in, so you have to be more agile. So what's interesting is, you know, waterfall is generally how kind of content does. You need to build, you know, build the model first, then you texture it, then you bring it into shots, then, you know, then you animate it, then you do that, you know. So it's definitely more of a waterfall. There's a little bit of kind of overlap that can happen concurrently, but you know, definitely more waterfall. But on the engineering side, you know, in a game, you're definitely more agile. So I found that kind of interesting. in games, working in the content side, but also working with engineers. So we kind of there are things that need to be waterfall, but you need to also take into account that you need to kind of be more agile. So it definitely kind of creates a slightly different culture, and and it's some things that actually working in agile has made me think about. Um, uh, it's made me kind of think about like if I was ever to go back to film, like how would I apply kind of those agile kind of methodology to it? I definitely have learned a lot about project management from games that I didn't really think of when I was in film. So it's quite an interesting thing. So proprietary versus commercial. So what I mean is, proprietary versus commercial tools. So film used to use a lot more proprietary tools early in my career. So for example, I gave was cloth. Cloth was not just an off-the-shelf type of thing. People often, different companies had different cloth engines, or sorry, not cloth engines, but different cloth solutions that were generally proprietary. But now use film uses a lot more commercial products. Like I said, cloth, a good example. It's like you wouldn't build your own cloth. Films are also, it's a an industry that they're starting to when I was part of it, often a single company would work on a single show, whereas now multiple companies work on multiple shows, or sorry, multiple companies work on a single show. So being able to share assets and all that kind of stuff is kind of forcing to have some more standards. So for those who don't know of USD, it's the Universal Scene Description Language, and it's an interesting way that it encompasses Alembic. So there's ways of kind of sharing assets and using them with USD. There's Open Color IO, Open EXR. There's a lot of standards, and there's a the Academy software. I think it's Foundation. Yeah, ASF, I think it is. But Academy Software Foundation, they end up running a lot of these open source projects because film really has embraced kind of open source or has embraced standards, and they're often open source that have been kind of USD. I think USD. Yeah, if I remember correctly, yeah, USD came from Pixar, but now is kind of being maintained by this kind of open source initiative. So on that side, proprietary versus games I personally find is kind of a little bit more exciting. There's a little bit more innovation pushing real time. Things have not been solved in games quite to the level of film, primarily because the real time dependencies. There's the things are a lot more difficult to like to have proper have proper simulations at 30 to 60 frames per second. So game still has a lot of proprietary solutions. There are some common data-driven game engines like Unreal and Unity, but there's also still a number of AAA studios that have proprietary game engines. So the example is obviously EA and Frostbite. So yeah, so I just want to kind of wrap things up with future challenges. And this is just from, like I said, this is my perspective. This isn't speaking on behalf of EA. I don't want to speak on behalf of EA. But just watching kind of from afar and seeing kind of what the challenges that I see that I find interesting. And this is also some of it's kind of games related, some of it's film related, some of it's both. But I think the real time advancements is really kind of a future challenge. Um, Although it's pretty amazing to see where it's at. Like the hardware advances will continue, so we'll be able to do more and more in real time. So real time solutions, they're getting better. There's real time ray tracing, strand hair, cloth, that kind of stuff. It's the advancements in real-time ray tracing because of the hardware advancements has been incredible, like visually. This has led to more crossover between film and games. The reason I have these images up on the right here, this is stuff I didn't work on. This is after I left, but these are shots of the real-time view volume for Mandalorian. normally this would be, for those who don't know the real-time view volumes, basically, normally they would film this type of stuff on a green screen. The problem with filming it on a green screen is then you get all this green bounce and, like Mandalorian, anything shiny would have green in it. So then you would put in a CG background, you'd replace the green with this, but then you'd also have to kind of fake the lighting on the character and everything. So the power of this view volume is, you basically are getting these shots filmed. The character looks like they're living in that environment because they literally have like this LED display around it. So this is a prime example of where real time is starting to kind of, the blur between film and games. And so they've got these real-time view volumes in films, and they're using, either proprietary stuff or game engines like Unreal. This is one thing that is interesting that I thought I'd bring up. So I'll just read it. Generic runtime real-time solutions still have challenges, so often customized per game title. So what I mean by that is, there is still a reason that we have game team SEs. It's not like a game engine can just solve everything for everyone. There's very different performance implications of, like, say, for example, UFC, you've got two fighters fighting there versus like FC has got 20 players on the pitch. So, you're going to solve these solutions, you're going to have different solutions for things. So yeah, so I would say that's one of the challenges is, like, sure, eventually if the hardware advances so much, you might maybe be able to use the exact same technology across all kind of game titles. But right now there is still some customizations that need to happen, and that's why you do still have game team SEs that are customizing it per game. Um, so yeah, so this one I just wanted to talk about kind of user generated content, so, or UGC that we often call. So players want more complexity, um, which is obviously a content challenge. Um, so the example I gave here is just, this is a procedural train system that we developed in EA. There's a an article on it. So this is just an example of, they wanted the golf course to look exactly like what it looked like in real life. But to build this thing with this level of complexity, would just, could take a massive amount of time. So what we've got is kind of procedural systems that you can specify, here's the bunker, and that'll fill it in with this and this and this and this. So you're not like hand placing every single minuscule tree or every bunker, this or that. Like, you can kind of do a bit more broader strokes, and then the detail gets kind of filled in procedurally. So players want that complexity, and how do we kind of achieve that in a realistic kind of manner, that's not going to kill 4 million people. So players want to customize their avatar or their games, their game itself as well. So how do we kind of do that? How do we nail the complexity, but also allow the ability to kind of customize things and to really drive the user generated content. So anyways, and yes, the procedural tools will help with that complexity. And then, yeah, the last one that I wanted to, just bring up, I don't have a ton of detail on that because, it's still something that we're all just kind of, like watching. So like the new opportunities with AI, it's obviously a very powerful technology. But, there's ethical questions on how best to use it and where it can kind of fit in. And really, what will these opportunities be? I'll leave this as a little vague, just because I don't think, we don't know the answers to all these questions, but it's definitely something that a lot of people are talking about, and a lot of things that watching the technology, seeing the potential, but then seeing how it can potentially fit is it's a good question. Definitely some opportunities, but yeah, we don't know really where it's going to go. So. But anyways, yeah, so that's kind of it. Yeah, I'll just open it up for questions.
Thanks, Tim.
And thank you. Yes, District 9 was very cool. Um, yeah, to answer, is it Island? Is that how you pronounce your name? Or
Yes,
Aeon?
yes. Both works.
Can't hear you. Oh, actually, just a sec. Sorry, just one sec. Hello, can you say your name again?
That's Oyon, but both works. That's fine.
Ion. Ion. Okay, sounds good. No, I just wanted to make sure. So yeah, so Ion, yes, I noticed your comment on District 9. It was, yeah, it was very cool. It was actually, just to give a bit of backstory, that one, um, I had I had been following Neil Blomkamp. He had done a bunch of like there was this Live in Joburg little short that he wrote, which is basically what District 9 is based on. And so I knew of this person that was, doing this amazing commercial work, and and then eventually was doing kind of little shorts and stuff that were showing up on YouTube, and it was pretty amazing. And so so I kind of knew of him. And then yeah, having an opportunity to work on District 9, and then just seeing this and then just watching it kind of explode was pretty it was pretty fun, wild. But yeah, you asked about crunch time and video games versus movies, um, especially with some gaming studios getting a bad name for it. Yeah, like, so my experience has been great. Like, I've worked at EA for 7 years now, and I haven't worked a 6-day week. Like, I haven't worked a Saturday in the entire 7 years. Um, and in film, unfortunately, just during crunch time, they get into the 6-day weeks. They get into the 10-hour days and stuff like that. So I can't really speak for other gaming companies, because yeah, we definitely, I read the same things as everyone does. So there's always bad companies. And yeah, so but I definitely, I can say that EA, and especially like within the EA Sports division that I've been working at for the past few years, it's just it's been really great for life work balance. And also I don't want to slight like I don't want to slight like the film companies or the film studios that I worked with. I don't blame them. It's just it's a tough one. The clients are asking for more and more and more and less time, and it just gets to a point where it gets to a point where you just have to work overtime, and it was always very satisfying doing the work. But it's also nice to have a full weekend and just be able to kind of unwind and everything like that. So, it's yeah, and I just and I just felt like it was just the industry as a whole was working harder and harder. I've heard for some people that are working in film, now the whole work from home situation makes things better. You can pop in for 4 hours on a Saturday, but not actually have to drive in. So you don't, at least don't have the commute or anything like that. So the work from home does that, but you still might work extra hours. It's just on your own time without any commute, which, obviously, yeah, working 4 hours, but then if you had a 2 hour commute, it would be like, it just kind of a pain. So, but anyways, yeah. So does that answer it for you?
Yes, thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah.
Okay, Ryan had a question. What's the size of teams you generally work with?
Um, so okay, so game side of things, um, on the game side of things, the tech artists, the tech art team that I would have, like, say on Plants vs. Zombies specifically, I think there was like 5 or 6 tech artists. The game as a whole, I'm actually not even sure how many there were. So they're definitely like EA Vancouver is like 2,000 plus people or something like that. So it's pretty massive. And then depending on kind of the size of your game, it can be in the hundreds of people range. But my direct team that I work with, like right now, the tech artists that I work with in Sports Tech Art, there's like 3 of us. But our team as a whole, including like the software engineers and everything, is I think getting into the 30 or 40 range. But then we also work closely with the Frostbite team. So then that starts spreading out. So yeah, so it really kind of depends. On the film side of things, it also depended on the movie. like on Star Wars, I think there was 30 lighters, 30 compositors, so it can get into the, like, the 50, 60 range. But yeah. So it's yeah, good question, and it's kind of all over the place. Yeah.
Hey, do you want me to read questions or you
I
can?
know, or I can read them, or you could read them if you, yeah, if you have them, because yeah, I have an
Okay,
11-year-old son who's good at. Sorry, so Sue, this is for your 11-year-old. So yeah, I have an 11-year-old son who is very good at Scratch, but is looking to get more into serious game development. What is a path forward he can take to get more into game dev? Um, that's a good question. It's something that actually, like my son, he's 16 and he's quite interested in games as well. Um, I would say, for me, like, with the game engines like Unity or Unreal, um, there's so much knowledge, like there's so much um tutorials and videos and all that kind of stuff out there. If you could get them if you could get your son a laptop that can handle kind of like Unreal or Unity and just kind of go through the training, I would definitely recommend that. There are some other game engines. I think um, like I think there's some open source ones. I'm blanking on the names of them, but yeah, there's tons of game engines out there. But for Unreal and Unity, you only like the way their business model works is you only pay if you sell a game and you make a certain amount of money and all that kind of stuff. So as far as like you can just download Unreal and Unity and start playing around with it. So and there's tons of stuff out there. There's also like there's courses on Udemy and all that kind of stuff. So if you wanted to have a more kind of regimented kind of course, you could look at some of those courses. But yeah, there's tons of stuff. And then as far as obviously like learning Frostbite, it's a proprietary game engine. You're not going to use it. But whenever we talk to people, it's always like, hey, if you've done a data-driven game engine like Unity or Unreal, then you're going to obviously have to learn something with Frostbite, but it's kind of the same paradigm. So, it doesn't, we obviously can't hire people that have Frostbite knowledge because it's not out there. So but that's what we look for. Um, did that answer your question, Sue? Any other follow-up? Um, I'll take that as a yes. What would you say were the major challenges that you faced when moving from an industry standard VFX company like ILM to a core game dev company like EA? Um, I, yeah, there was, what I liked about it was also the biggest challenge was like I felt dumb sometimes. I didn't know what I didn't know, and I'd be in meetings and sometimes it was actually quite funny because there was terminology. I would write down terminology. I had some great mentors. So I would just be in meetings and I'd be writing down terminology where I'm like, what did they mean by this? What they mean by that? And it was funny because sometimes the terminology would be like game specific, sometimes it would be EA specific, sometimes it would be like Plants vs. Zombies specific. And so yeah, so what I loved about it was like actually, being 20 years into my career and just being like, I don't know what they're talking about. And also like when we're talking, we had some performance kind of issues that we were talking about, and I'm like, I don't know performance because they were talking milliseconds and they were talking GPU captures and they were talking this and this and this. And performance concerns in film was like we had 10-hour render times and they weren't getting done overnight, and so milliseconds wasn't really in our lexicon or anything like that. So yeah, so I would say just yeah, the challenge was like there was aspects I understood and there was aspects I didn't know. But honestly, that was why I wanted this change. I wanted a life work balance, but I also wanted to kind of mix it up and understand game engines. Another thing, and the reason I brought this up was I very much knew in film, okay, this is a problem for this artist, or this is a problem for like the pipeline TV, or this is a problem for our R&D team. And I kind of understood that divide. Whereas in games, what I found interesting was like, okay, so what does a TA do versus what does an artist do? And then we had artists that were more technical so they could handle some things. So it's not a hard line or anything. So some technical, some artists that are more technical could handle kind of this thing. But then there's stuff that's technical that a TA would deal with. But then it would get to a certain point where we'd have to hand it off to a software engineer. But would we hand it off to a game team software engineer? Or would you hand it off to a Frostbite software engineer? And so just understanding kind of that divide, I found that kind of like, oh, I don't really understand this. And so I found that really interesting as well. But it was like, and then what falls like on a game designer? We have game designers, we have technical game designers. And same thing with UI. We have UI, but we have UI kind of technical designers. And so yeah, so there's just there's a lot more stuff that I didn't know. But now I remember like 3-4 years in, and I started talking, and I sounded like I was in games. I was like, hey, I know this stuff. I'm not as stupid. So I think it's good. If I could recommend anything, it's like just you're never too old to learn, and to mix things up. And I really super appreciate. I was wanting to learn game engines on the side. While I was working in film, because I kept hearing about these game engines and the view volumes and all this, and so this stuff coming. So I was super interested in game engines, but I didn't have time. And so I'm super appreciative that EA hired me, knowing that, hey, I had this knowledge, but I didn't have this knowledge. So the fact they gave me this opportunity was really awesome. And so I really, yeah, I really got to appreciate that. It's like, hey, I was paid to learn. This was really nice of them. And I would like to think that, my ramp up was not as harsh, but I totally appreciated that. Oh, Nathan, yes, Godot, that's the one. Thank you. Yeah, Godot. Nathan wrote the Godot, and that's the open source game engine that I've only heard about. I haven't played with it or haven't heard anything specific. So, and then Sue. Oh, Chris, you wrote, yeah. So Chris wrote back to Sue saying, "Hi, my son's 16, is aspiring game designer. He started with Scratch, then learned some basics of programming in Python, then moved on to making models in Blender, or just learning how to make assets for a game. Then moved on to Unreal. Lots learned from trial and error and YouTube demos." Yeah. So yeah, I would agree with Chris totally. The one thing is game designers, it is, yeah, it's like I would encourage your sons or daughters to explore games and explore game design and everything. But I definitely, game designers are like, I think, I, from my standpoint, and I just speak on behalf of myself, game design is like kind of the really hard, like I think it's the most difficult one to get into. I don't think there's as many game designers in games, and I think you have to be like really top notch kind of level game designer. So I definitely wouldn't discourage them from going into it, but I think it's probably one of the more tougher gigs to get into, and really something that you're competing with the best, and I think there's only so many jobs. So I would definitely encourage people, but I would just say also just encourage, like like what your son did there, Chris, is learn kind of all aspects of game design, because you might find that, oh, actually you like the tech art side, or hey, you want to be an artist, or you want to be an engineer, you like the whole gameplay side of things and do this and that. So I think game design is definitely an awesome thing to do, but just but there is lots of other opportunities, and game design is just one of the smaller ones that's definitely a pretty coveted spot. Yeah. And like I said, I say that just from my perception of, like, I just see how many people are at game companies, and how many are the actual game designers. And so definitely just keep your options open, is what I would say. Yeah. It's funny, as a side note, my kids I say go for your dreams, because I went for my dreams and I got it. But then at the same time, I would encourage people to, go for your dreams. But, like, I had my dream job in film, but then I kind of got burnt out from the life work balance. And so I kind of changed things. And now all of a sudden I see this whole other world in games, and it's really cool. So I think you go for your dreams, but you also be kind of pragmatic of, like, have some backup plans. You know, go for your dreams, and I can attest you can achieve them sometimes. But then at the same time, you know, your dreams, you know, it's still a job. You still want to be pragmatic. You want to be that, and so I would just encourage, yeah, like any kids out there that want to get into games, that absolutely go for games. And if you want to go for game design, absolutely go for it. But there's also a lot of different opportunities, and there's so many different opportunities. So don't just kind of limit yourself of I'm only going to do game design.
Okay, so there's a couple questions in the chat, so I don't want to take too
Yes.
much
Yeah.
too
No,
much of
I
your
can
time.
I
So
can answer those. Yeah. No, I'm fine answering them. Do you
okay,
think that Node? Sorry, this is from Michael. Um, do you think that node-based coding will eventually take over scripting? Um, that's a good question. Um, it's it's funny. I'm I'm pretty old school. Uh, and so there's times where I'm like, I find debugging node-based stuff sometimes can be really hard. Um, I also, I think, I don't think it'll completely ever replace things, but I guess what I would say is I don't think it will completely replace things, because I do know like there's a lot of node-based stuff that happens. Like say in Unreal, for example, you can do, I don't use Unreal myself, but I know that blueprinting allows you to basically do some kind of like tools through their node-based kind of system. And you can build some really cool tools. You can build some cool, you know, game features and all that kind of stuff without actually doing any coding. So I think absolutely you don't want to kind of dismiss it and say, hey, we should never do node-based stuff. Because I remember talking to some engineers, and they were pretty hardcore of like, this node-based stuff, it's, you know, it's too hard to debug and everything like that. So that all being said, is sometimes with node-based systems, if you have someone that's not very technical doing some node-based stuff, they can create some pretty nightmare looking kind of node graphs and stuff like that. And you would see that even in film. Like film, we would have node-based compositing or node-based lighting, and you could create some kind of nightmare kind of nodes and stuff like that. So I think the key is if you are going to do node-based programming, treat it as programming. Make sure that it's modular, make sure that it's clean, make sure like, because you can write code that's really ugly and it can run, but people would yell at you, you know, they'd code review it and they'd look at it badly. And I find sometimes when I'm looking at these like massive node trees, and if it's kind of, you know, someone that's not really taking the attention to really treat it as if it's code. So yeah, so for me, I think there's definitely opportunities where it could, you know, take over things. But I don't think it'll take over completely, but I definitely see it as kind of a gateway into like not having to like do some hardcore coding. You know, the same thing honestly has happened with just like programming in general. You know, programming used to be a lot more about memory management and dealing with this and making sure and having like a, you know, pointer that was pointing off into nowhere land kind of thing. And now memory management in so many languages have just kind of gone away. You know, it's auto done, and you don't have to worry about it. So I think for me, node-based coding, you know, is definitely going to be a thing that, yeah, that you know, maybe becomes more prominent for sure. But I don't think it'll completely replace coding. Um, what do you find the most exciting thing now? Do you explore stuff on the side? Um, so I have this thing, which is basically a sim rig. Um, and I was big into Formula One racing. And when the pandemic happened and I saw all the sim racers doing, or sorry, all the F1 drivers doing their sim rig. So I got really passionate about this thing. I kind of got out of habit of doing that. But yeah, it was wild. It was for me, my passion for during the pandemic was like doing sim racing. And what I found fascinating is I had been watching Formula One since I was young. And I watch Formula One now differently because I was like watching the corners and seeing the corner and watching them spin and do this and that. And then hilariously, or ironically, I was playing F1, and then EA actually bought Codemasters. So the next year I got it for free because I got it as a free EA title. Yeah, so that's one passion that I have is the sim racing side of things. So I got more and more into video games. I definitely, I played Last of Us. So I found, yeah, I found kind of getting into EA, all of a sudden I had this appreciation for games. Like I said, I'm not a great gamer. I think my fast twitch skills are useless. My son well exceeded me at 10. Because when you're old, your fast twitch muscles are not there. So yeah, I really like gaming. I really like really like the sim racing side of things. One day being possibly involved somewhat in the F1 game would be really neat as well. To play a game that you're really passionate about would be really neat. And then yeah, and then for me, I've enjoyed um, um, one of the things that I'm dealing with now. I can't get into too specifics, but I'm more tightly. I've kind of in the gaming side of things. On the gaming side of thing, or sorry, at EA, my specific role, I worked on a couple of games, so I kind of was part of the whole game cycle. But then what I'm part of now, which is the sports tech art, dealing with kind of initiatives and kind of like dealing with kind of products and it's been a very interesting journey. Like I'm working a lot closer with some Frostbite game team SC or sorry, Frostbite engineers. I'm also working a lot closer with some of our UX team and kind of dealing with things that are product, working closer with the producers. So I've been really enjoying this kind of new role. It's like it was great to like understand how games were made, but then now kind of seeing a little bit behind the scenes of like what a game engine, what it takes to build kind of game engines, plus mixed with kind of dealing with kind of more products and getting closer to producers and stuff. So I've been really enjoying that. And that's frankly, honestly, that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about games in general is um um it's just opened my eyes open to like, oh hey, there's a lot more, like I knew film so well and I knew like, okay, well, if I'm going to be a CG soup, then eventually I might be a VFX soup and then I will deal with that. And it was kind of clear, whereas with games I've got so many options of like, oh, I just didn't even know this sports tech art thing came along and I'm like, oh, this is really cool, this sounds cool, and I kind of put my hat in the ring and got involved. So I find what I found interesting is with games, it's just there is a lot more options and it's been fun to not have a clear path of where I'm going. So always look for change. I recommend that. And EA is, yeah, EA's, it's been interesting. It's a job that I've stayed the longest in my career at. And part of it is because I feel like I've had like kind of three different jobs throughout my time there. So I've been really enjoying it. And that's one of the advantages of being part of a large company like EA is there's a lot of opportunities and just different careers inside careers kind of thing. So definitely have been enjoying that.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, everyone.
A great presentation.
Thanks,
And
Paul.
thank you to those who attended.